All right. Our next speaker has a fascinating background that blends technical expertise with exceptional writing skills. Please join me in welcoming Monika Bhatt, a senior technical writer at Canva. Today, she's going to shed light on a critical yet often overlooked part of software development, technical writing. In her talk titled, I Can Code, Can You Write? That's a pretty interesting title, to be honest. Monika will explain the importance of tech writing in the software development lifecycle and offer tips on writing clear and useful documentation. Please welcome Monika Bhatt.
It's switched on. Thank you so much. That was quite an introduction. I did not expect it to be that good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast. You can all close your eyes and sleep for the next 30 minutes. I'm just kidding. It's not a podcast. Now that I have your attention, all of you have spent some time and effort to be here. I've spent some time and effort to create this presentation. So as I go through this presentation, I'd like you all to at least think about 3 things that you can take home today. Like take home does not literally, don't take away the chairs and tables, please. But then take away something that you can use in your daily life, and I'll be a happy person. So let's get started. So the agenda of my presentation is pretty simple. I'm just going to talk about who am I. Because you're listening to my presentation, I'm just going to give you some background on myself. What is tech writing? I don't suppose a lot of you know what tech writing is. I think a lot of people, whenever I talk to people, everybody comes to me with what exactly is tech writing? What do you do? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Why should you care about what tech writing is, and why should you care about tech writing in general? And how can you write better? So my title is I Can Code, Can You Write? I don't mean it in an arrogant way, but then as tech writers, we know a little bit of coding that makes life easier for people around us, right? Similarly, as professionals, all of us must know how to write effectively, and I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on how to do that. Very simple. So let's start with who am I? Hello, my name is Monika Bhatt. I'm a senior technical writer at Canva. When I was growing up and somebody asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I used to say I want to be a doctor. So I became an engineer, and now I'm a technical writer. So I never said I wanted to be a technical writer when I grew up. I did not even know what it was. So my career as a writer started when I was doing my bachelor's degree. So I wanted to earn some extra bucks, and I was looking for something that's pretty easy to do. And I found content writing, right? And content writing involved writing gossipy, cheesy articles like, who is Johnny Depp dating? How many girlfriends does Johnny Depp have? So that is the kind of content I wrote as in the starting of my career. Then I moved on to write some travel and trekking and tourism content. I'm from Nepal, and travel and tourism is pretty big out there. So I started writing that. And once I graduated, I started working as a developer intern, but then I got called upon by a company who was looking for a technical writer. So I had the writing background and some technical background because I did my electronics and communication engineering degree. So that's how I got into technical writing. I came to Australia to do my master's, and then I'm still a technical writer now. So that's a little bit of background on myself. Next, I'll talk about what is tech writing. So if I ask what is tech writing to you guys, you'll all be like, it's just writing technical stuff, right? But then it's much more than that. It's API documentation, product documentation, infrastructure design, architecture design, search, and engineering docs, which I'll all talk about in the following slides. So let's start with something pretty basic, which is product documentation. So product documentation is the most easy aspect of technical writing, I would say. A product can be anything. It can be a software as a service. It can be a conventional application. Or it can also be an orange. An orange is a product, right? How do you peel the orange? How do you eat the orange? How do you throw the peel in the dustbin? It can be documentation, though not technical, but it's still documentation about a product. So technical writing involves product documentation. You understand the product. You understand how it solves user problems. And you write how to solve a certain problem. And we use what is called the docs as code workflow. So gone are the days when documentation was done in Microsoft Word and you had heaps and heaps of Microsoft Word documents. So that's now not how it works now. You use docs as code workflow. I'll talk about this later. Nothing against Microsoft Word. I love it. It's good for writing blogs and single-page documents and then research papers and stuff, but it's not good for product documentation. The next thing is API docs, which is pretty self-explanatory. You understand the API, because you cannot write about something until and unless you understand it, right? You document parameter descriptions and error handling messages. So this is usually done by developers, but then tech writers assist developers in doing that as well. You use and test the APIs, and you create API reference using Swagger, OpenAPI, or Redoc, and create example apps. So you need to include code or example code in your documentation. So you need to write that as well. So that's what API docs involves. The next thing involved in technical writing is architecture design, which is a very loose term I've used. So it can include modularity. So just like code, content needs to be reusable too. There's some content that is common across different documents, right? So how do you achieve the modularity of the content? How do you achieve the hierarchy and navigation? So what would be the top-down structure be like? How do you make sure that the flow is correct or the flow is understandable? How do you categorize content? So your content, if it talks about a frequently asked question, then it should go under the FAQ section. If it's a how-to guide, then it should go under the how-to section. So that kind of categorization is also a part of technical writing that you need to think about. Then comes standardization. So each company has certain brand voice or brand identity. So you need to adhere to that when you're writing documentation. So that is also something that falls under technical writing. The next thing is maintenance. So just imagine you have an API and it has a breaking change. Somebody who is using the API, and if your breaking change is not reflected in the documentation, it will break the API. So the maintenance part of the documentation is also something tech writers do. So the next thing is the tech behind tech writing, right? You have a lot of documentation. Where do you put it? So the infrastructure design part of technical writing is also something that we do. And it is something that I like a lot as well. So do you use a content management system? So content management system is just an application or a documentation application that you can use to write content. You don't have to be extremely technical about it. You don't need to know how to code, but then it's simple, like WordPress, Drupal, or Joomla. If you're not using a content management system, then you can probably use a static site generator. So a static site generator is what entails the docs as code workflow. So what does docs as code mean? What does docs as code mean is similar to code. You document using code, which is markdown or restructured text. You feed that into a static site generator, and then it gives you outputs. It can be HTML outputs, PDF outputs, anything. So once you do that, you also need to think about the version control. Do you use Git, SVN? What do you use? Do you use a paid or an open source solution? And some examples of static site generators are mkdocs, Pinks, Gatsby, and Hugo. So then after that, you need to think about hosting. So where do you host your documentation? Cloudflare Docs, Read the Docs, in internal servers, or if you are only shipping PDF or text outputs to your clients, then probably you don't even need to host it anywhere. So this is also one part of technical writing we need to think about. The next is continuous integration and continuous delivery. So just like code, documentation also needs to have automated builds, publishing, staging in prod environments, hooks and linters for grammar and formatting checks. So you can see that technical writing is not just about writing. There's a lot of background involved in it. And this is what this slide is meant to show. The next thing is, just imagine you're coming home after a long day at work and you want to eat some pizza, right? You search for pizza restaurants near me, and all you're getting in your results are pizza recipes. So you want to eat pizza, but then this is showing you how to make pizza from scratch. So what this means is you can have the best restaurant, but then if it does not appear in your search results, then there is no use of the restaurant, right? Similarly, amazing content without search is like throwing a diamond in the ocean, hoping someone will find it. So the search aspect is also something that tech writers need to think about. So search can include using the built-in functionalities. So I talked about the content management systems and static site generators, right? So these have some built-in functionalities that you can use for search. If not, you can use external plugins. So you can use external plugins like Algolia, JavaScript Search, and Lunar.js in those content management systems or static site generators to improve search. If that is not working out for you, then you can probably use a custom solution like semantic search. Semantic means the meaning behind words. So an orange might mean color to you, and it might mean fruit to me. So how do you differentiate between the different meanings of the same word? So that is what semantic search entails. In fact, my master's presentation was also related to this, but the topic is very long, so I'm not going to say, I'm not going to talk about that. Then comes the personalization and user profiling part of it. So how do you personalize search for your users? Like, do you use Google Analytics? Do you use AI? Do you use building user profiles? Do you recommend documentation? Recommend documentation based on user history? Or you can also use AI-driven chatbots. So your chatbot can answer queries about where to find a certain documentation. Then you can also employ some feedback loop for continuous learning, knowing if the search results that the users are getting is what they are searching for or not. So these are all aspects of search in a documentation infrastructure that tech writers think about. What about the content? So your content must also be optimized for search. So how do you optimize it? You use relevant keywords. You use compelling title and descriptions. So remember I talked about who is Johnny Depp dating earlier, right? So if that's the kind of content somebody is searching, then if your title matches that, then your documentation appears at the top of the search results. So that is how you optimize content for search. And you put in engaging content and optimize the structure. The other part of technical writing is engineering docs, which is also a very loose term for architecture docs. So tech writers create architecture docs, design docs, engineering best practice docs. Imagine a company with 10,000 employees. How do all those developers know what the best practices for documentation is? So this kind of engineering practice docs are also written by technical writers. Then comes training materials. So if some developer needs to understand the product inside out, the training materials can also be written by technical writers, and some white papers as well. So I talked a lot about all of this. Why should you care? Why should you care about what technical writing is? Why should you care about what it entails? So anyone here looking for a job switch or a recent graduate? I cannot see many hands, but still, okay. If you can make complex things simple, and if you can write documentation effectively, tech writing can be a good career prospect for you, since you can see that it does not just involve writing, it involves a lot of background stuff, it involves a lot of coding as well. The other thing is missed use cases. Since tech writers work closely with the users, end users, so if there is any use case that is missed in the product itself, then tech writers are best suited to gauge it and then let the team know. The other thing is improved product usability. There is no use of a product that no one can use. So you have a good product, but nobody knows how to use it. So that's where tech writers come in between. You can write effective documentation to improve the product usability. The next thing is testing and QA. Since we are involved in the documentation at the end of the product development or the software development workflow, we also act as testers or QA. The next is middle person. So there might be sometimes two teams working in the same project, but then in different modules. So sometimes tech writers are the middle person who are working across both these teams, and they can let the teams know about something that's missed out. The next thing is improved UX. So every brand has a brand voice and brand identity, and that is maintained by tech writers as well, because that is an aspect that's called UX writing, which is also done by technical writers. So this ensures that there is consistency across the product. So how can you write well? So I talked a lot about what the technical writing involves. I can do a bit of coding, and it makes life easier for people around me. How can you, as professionals, write well to make your documentation more effective? So this is what is called the 6 C's of writing well. First is clarity, which means that your content should be clear. Conciseness, it should be to the point. Coherence, which means that it should have a proper flow. Consistency, which means that you cannot refer to a term oranges in one part of your documentation and as mandarins in the other part and lemons in the third part, right? How do you achieve the consistency? So that is also one part of technical writing. Then comes correctness. Sorry, I'll just go back. Then comes correctness. Your documentation should be correct. And comes completeness. Your documentation should be complete. So I do not expect you all to remember all this, but even if you can remember a few C's, it will be easier for you. And I'm going to show some examples. The first thing you can do when you're writing documentation is think of your audience. So let's take the topic of Wi-Fi, for example. For a general public, your definition of Wi-Fi would be it is an invisible librarian who delivers books to your devices, and your general public will be able to understand it, right? But then for IT professionals, you can write it's a wireless network protocol that allows devices to communicate over radio waves. For a network engineer, you can write it as it operates on IEEE standards and utilizes MIMO technology. For marketing professionals, you can write it as invisible thread connecting our devices to the world. So if you put the definition of network engineers that you have created for network engineers for the general public, they'll not be able to understand it. So how do you do that? It is not expected of you to write 4 different articles for the same topic, right? But what you can do is when you're thinking of your audience, think of the audience with the least level of technical skill. So if you cater to that audience, the one with the least level of technical skill, then your documentation will be understandable by everybody. The next thing is, just look at this. And it's a lot of long words and jargony text to say, my name is Monika Bhatt. So you can see that the left side is not understandable. Though it looks good in poetry, it does not look good in documentation. So you don't have to be Shakespeare to write. You can avoid jargon. You can use the simplest of words. You don't have to understand. You don't have to have a big vocabulary. But you can write effectively by using the simplest of words. So you don't have to be Shakespeare to write. Avoid jargon wherever possible. And this is how you achieve clarity and conciseness. The next thing is, just look at this picture where we have a lot of individual stuff. That is all good. We have nice images, and we have nice cushions, and we also have a cactus there. But then it's all put together, jumbled in the same spot. Then look at this image where you do not have a lot of stuff, but it's spread across very nicely, and it looks cleaner. So just remember, whenever you're writing content, less is more. Use as less words as possible to mean the same thing. So this is also how you achieve conciseness. So what I like to say is, whenever you're writing, think of your user's mind as Sydney real estate. It's so expensive, right? It's so expensive, it's so hard to get in. Once you get in, do you like to fill it with rubbish, or do you like to fill it with stuff that matters? So think of your user's mind that way, and you'll be able to understand that less is more, and conciseness can be achieved with the simplest of words. The next thing is using prose or using lists with emphasis. So look at this one, which is a huge paragraph, which you have to read it all to understand what it's talking about. And look at this one, where oranges is bold, and then there's a list. So as you skim through, you can understand that this paragraph is talking about oranges and their benefits. So use bold, use lists wherever necessary, wherever possible, and that will make your documentation clearer. So this is also how you achieve clarity in your documentation. The next thing is visuals. We all know that visuals speak louder than words, but sometimes. Use screenshots, use flowcharts, use short videos, use mind maps, and use tables wherever possible. But then please remember not to overdo it. So nobody wants to watch a long video of somebody doing something if that could just be done in like 2 lines of documentation, right? So you should know how to place visuals sparingly in your documentation, but use it wherever possible to make your content better. The final thing that you can remember is remember the BER of remember. It's very easy, right? Just the BER, the last 3 letters of remember. Remember the BER of remember, and what does BER stand for? The first thing is background. B stands for background. Whenever you're writing documentation, think about what background you can give to the user. You can give a purpose. You can give them the definitions of used terms, requirements, limitations, and assumptions. Remember to give them some background. Then E stands for examples. So is there any example, or are there any examples that can supplement your content or that can make your content better, such as code samples, use cases, common issues, questions, or sample docs, sample data? The R stands for references. So any related links, standards documents, websites, or online resources you can think of that can supplement your content and make your content a little bit better, then please involve it. So remember the BER of remember, and you'll be good to go. So this is an example. So this just says orange trees infected by citrus greening disease can see a yield of whatever. That's a long thing. But if you just give this without any context, it's not understandable. But if you give a little bit of context, an overview which says that citrus greening disease is a bacterial infection, and then the impact on cultivation and some references. So a user will be able to understand the context behind it, will be able to refer to extra information on it. So this is how you achieve the burr of remember. So key takeaways from my presentation: think of your audience, write with the audience with the least level of technical skill in mind, avoid unnecessary jargon, less is more, just remember that less is more, use lists and emphasis wherever possible because that makes documentation clearer, use visuals but use it sparingly, and remember the burr of remember. That's all for today. Thank you so much. Any questions? Please let me know. Thank you.
Cheers for that. I was wondering if you have any practical techniques for consistency, particularly when you've got more than one person writing some of this documentation?
I would maintain a guide, I would say, because consistency where it becomes a problem is in products, like when you have a UI where you are using different terms to mean the same thing, right? So if you maintain a documentation upfront whenever you are like creating the product and say that you refer to this term for wherever you in the documentation possible and in the product, then that would make sense. So what happens is it's an issue that we also come across a lot because the engineering team has decided that this product will be named something else. And the documentation is named something else, referring to the same product as something else. So there is no collaboration between the development team and the technical writers, and that creates a gap. So first thing is, I think involve technical writers or like whoever is writing your documentation in your day-to-day workflow, because this is an integral part of SDLC that people miss out on, and it becomes an issue later on. So integrate everyone who is writing the documentation and let them know what changes are taking place, and then maintain a standards documents which says that this term means this in your product line. Consistency is not a problem in normal documentation where you are writing simple words, but then it is an issue when it comes to the product and the name of the product and then the UI terms of the product. So I would say that those two would be my suggestions.
And differences in style in writing?
Differences in style in writing, I think this is a personal opinion. I don't mind much on that, as long as the content is understandable. Yes, we follow a style guide. Yes, we have the Google style guide. We have company-based. I was also involved in creating a style guide for the previous company that I worked for. But I don't think that's an issue as long as the content is understandable. Yes, consistency matters when it comes to naming the product, UI, stuff like that. But then as long as it's understandable, as long as you are under agreement of using 1, 2, 3, 4 or lists like, A, B, C, D, those kinds of things. Otherwise, apart from that, I think different writing styles would not be an issue. But I know of tech writers who would not agree with that. But for me, that's not an issue.
Hi, for someone who's an engineer who's written a lot of technical documentation but is having to write a product manual for end users for the first time, would you have any suggestions or tips on how to structure or architect a product manual where, for instance, it's documenting something with multiple screens? So would you recommend documenting them in the user that they would encounter each screen at a time, or the more important ones or more widely used ones should go first? How would you go about, like, say, structuring a product manual?
That's a really good question. Thank you. I would start with the background first, as I mentioned, right? So what the product is about, what does it do? And usually my go-to way is UI. So whatever comes first in the UI is something I will document first. But then there are cases, it depends totally on your product, right? There are cases when UI is not the first thing that users should go through. For instance, you have to create something somewhere else for it to be populated in some part of the UI, right? So in that case, I would start with that. So it completely depends on what your documentation is, right? What your product is like. And then I would start with a static site generator. I had mentioned about it earlier. And I would also implement version control. So you probably don't have a technical writer in your team, right? But then if you are just dumping, yeah, that's the case with a lot of companies, like developers are tech writers and QA as well. And what happens is down the line, when your product grows and your documentation is not scalable, it becomes big of an issue. So even if you don't have a technical writer, just start with something. It does not have to be perfect. That's why my title is I Can Code, Can You Write? You don't have to write perfectly, but you can start with something and you can maintain versions of it as the product versions grow, maintain the versions of it, and later maybe your company will hire a technical writer who can clean it up for you. But then, yeah, coming back to your question, so it depends totally on your product. If your product does not have a lot of prerequisites on what to do first, then you can go from the UI from first, and I would create different documents for each part of the UI, not all in one place, because that becomes overwhelming to the user. So, or you can go on the, like in the what do I do first kind of flow, which should also be completely separate from each other. I would separate it out as well. Does it answer your question? Yeah. Thank you so much.
I've got one as well.
Sure.
Yeah. So my question is about, do you have tips for when it's best to do the technical documentation? So for example, the projects I work on, we're always rushing to get features out, and it's like, oh, we'll do the technical documentation later, because if we do it when we're doing the development, usually there's changes, so you sort of have to try and keep that up to date. But the trouble is, if you're like, oh, we'll do it later, you either forget, move on to the next feature, or by that stage, you've kind of forgotten the nitty-gritty about how something works and why.
Yeah.
Especially as we don't have a specific technical writer, we've just got the developers.
Yeah.
What's your recommendation for when to fight for the technical documentation to be done?
I would say always. I would always say always, because once you try to do it at the end, it becomes an issue, as you mentioned, right? If there is a dedicated technical writer, they might be like, able to do it at the end. But still, wherever I've worked, we have been always on par with the development team. So we go and attend all those meetings. We understand what the product is about, what is being built and why. So that gives us a context of how to start. So there is the introduction part you might have to start with. There are some background things that you have to start with. And even if there are changes, even if you go along writing the documentation, you can always implement the changes later, or you can go back to the documentation and change the screenshots or change whatever content you want to. But then the idea behind building a product would stay, right? It's not going to change a lot. So I would say it should be concurrent with documentation development, because at the end it does not make sense. So as a technical writer, what I do is also I do it as the development team is doing it. And because we follow agile practices, so it's easier because iteratively parts of code or parts of the product are being shipped, and we can do the documentation part by part as well. So I would say that would be.
I hope one day we get a dedicated technical writer.
Yeah, I hope all companies get that.
Thank you.
Everybody has the same issue. Thank you so much.
I'm so sorry. I just want to be more mindful of the time. We can stick around and ask questions later if she doesn't mind. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you, Monika.
Thank you so much. Thank you.